Chapter 1 of the Third Person. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anthony Orr. The Third Person by Henry James. Chapter 1. When, a few years since, two good ladies, previously not intimate, nor indeed more than slightly acquainted, found themselves domiciled together in the small but ancient town of Mar, it was as a result, naturally, of special considerations. They bore the same name and were second cousins, but their paths had not hitherto crossed, and there had not been coincidence of age to draw them together, as Miss Thrush, though more mature, had spent much of her life abroad. She was a bland, sketching person, whom fate has condemned to a monotony, triumphing over a variety of Swiss and Italian pensions, in any one of which, with her well-fastened hat, her gauntlets and her stout boots, her camp-stool, her sketch-book, her Tanchit's novel, she would have served with particular propriety as a frontispiece for the natural history of the English old maid. She would have struck you as indeed, poor Miss Thrush, as so happy an instance of the type that she would perhaps scarce that she would have been able to equip with her with the dignity of the individual. This is what she enjoyed, however, for those brought nearer by a very insistent identity, once even of prettiness, but which now, blanched and bony, timid and inordinately queer, with its utterance all vague interjects and its aspect all eyeglasses and teeth, might be acknowledged without inconvenience and deplored without reserve. Miss Amy, her kinswoman, who 10 years her junior, showed a different figure, such as, oddly enough, though formed almost wholly in English air, might have appeared to betray a more foreign influence. Miss Amy was brown, brisk and expressive. When really young she had even been pronounced showy. She had an innocent vanity on the subject of her foot, a member which she somehow regarded as a guarantee of wit, or at least of her good taste. Even had it not been so pretty, she flattered herself that she would have been shod. She would never, no, never like Susan, have given it up. Her bright brown eye was comparatively bold, and she had accepted Susan once and for all as a frump. She even thought her, silently deplored her as a goose. She was none the less herself a lamb. They had benefited, this innocuous pair, under the will of an old aunt, a prodigiously ancient gentlewoman, of whom, in her later time, it had been given them, mainly by the office of others, to see almost nothing, so that the little property they had came in for the happy effect of a windfall. Each, at least, pretended to the other that they had never dreamed, as in the truth there had been small encouragement for dreams in the side character of what they now spoke as the late lady's dreadful entourage, terrified and deceived, as they considered by her own people. Mrs. Thrush was scantily enough just to have been counted on for an act of almost inspired justice. The good luck of her husband's nieces was that she had really outlived, for the most part, their ill wishers, and so, at the very last, had died without the blame of diverting fine Thrush property from fine Thrush use. Property quite of her own she had done as she liked with. But she had pitied poor expatriated Susan, and remembered poor unhusbanded Amy, through lumping them together through perhaps a little roughly in her family provision. Her will directed that, should no other arrangement be more convenient to her executors, the old house at Mar might be sold for their joint advantage. What befell, however, in the event, was that the two legatees, advised in due course, took an early occasion, and quite without concert, to judge their prospects on the spot. They arrived at Mar, each on her own side, and they were so pleased with Mar that they remained. So it was that they met. Miss Amy, accompanied by the office boy of the local solicitor, presented herself at the door of the house to ask admittance of the caretaker. But when the door opened, it offered a sight not the caretaker, but an unexpecting lady in a very old waterproof, who held a long-handled eyeglass very much as a child holds a rattle. Miss Susan, already in the field, roaming, prying, meditating in the absence of an errand of the woman in charge, offered herself in this manner as a settled possession, and it was on the idea that, through the eyeglass, the cousins viewed each other with some penetration even before Amy came in. Then at last when Amy did come in, it was not, any more than Susan, to go out again. It would take us too far to imagine what might have happened had Miss Thrush made it a condition of her benevolence that the subject of it should live at peace together, under the roof she left them, but it is certain that as they stood there, they had each, at the same moment, the same unprompted thought. Each became aware, on the spot, that the dear old house itself was exactly what she, and exactly what the other, wanted. It met in perfection their longing for a quiet harbour and an assured future. Each, in short, was willing to take the other in order to get the house. It was therefore not sold, it was made, instead, their own, as it stood, with the dead lady's extremely good old appurtenances not only undisturbed and undivided, but piously reconstructed and infinitely admired. The ancients of her testamentary purpose rejoicing meanwhile to see the business so simplified. They might have had their private doubts, or their wives might have, some might cynically predicted the sharpest of quarrels, before 3 months were out, between the deluded yoke fellows and the disillusion of their partnership, with every circumstance of recrimination. All that needed to be said is such prophets would have prophesied vulgarly. The Misses Thrush were not vulgar, and they had dropped deep with the cup of singleness and found it prevailingly bitter. They were not unacquainted with solitude and sadness, and they recognized with due humility the supreme opportunity of their lives. By the end of 3 months, moreover, each knew the worst about the other. Miss Amy took her evening nap before dinner, and how at which Miss Susan could never sleep. It was so odd, where Miss Susan took hers just after that meal, just at the hour when Miss Amy was keenest for talk. Miss Susan, erect and unsupported, had feelings, I should say, in which almost any posture could pass for a seated one. Miss Amy managed to find a place in the small of her back for 2 out of the 3 sofa cushions, a smaller place, obviously, that they had ever been intended to fit. But when all this was said, they continued to have on either side the pleasant consciousness of a personal soil, not devoid of fragmentary ruins to dig in. They each had a theory that their lives had been immensely different, and each appeared now to the other that conducted their careers so perversely, only that she should have an unfamiliar range of anecdote for her companion's ear. Miss Susan, at foreign pensions, had met the Russian, the Polish, the Danish, and even an occasional flower of the English nobility, as well as many of the most extraordinary Americans, who, as she said, had made everything of her, and with whom she had remained, often in correspondence, while Miss Amy, after all less conventional, at the end of her long years in London, abounded in reminiscences of literary, artistic, and even Miss Susan heard it with bated breath, theatrical society, under the influence of which she had been written. There, it came out, a novel that had been anonymously published in a play that had been strikingly type-copied. Not the least charm, clearly, of this picturesque outlook in Mar would be the support that might be drawn from it from getting work back, as she hinted, with general society bravely sacrificed, to real work. She had it in her head hundreds of plots, with which the future, accordingly, seemed to bristle for Miss Susan. The latter, on her side, was only waiting for the wind to go down to take up again her sketching. The wind at Mar was often high, as were natural in a little old huddled, red-roofed, historic south coast town in which had once been a manor mistress, as the cousins reminded each other of the Channel, and from which, high and dry on its hilltop though it might be, the sea had not so far receded as not to give constantly a taste of temper. Miss Susan came back to English scenery with a small sigh of fondness to which the consciousness of the Alps and Apennines only gave more of a quaver. She had picked out her subjects, and with her head on one side and a sense that they were easier abroad, sat sucking her water brush and nervously, perhaps even a little inconsistently, waiting and hesitating. What had happened that they had, each for herself, rediscovered the country. Only Miss Amy, emerging from Bloomsbury lodging, spoke of it as primroses and sunsets, as Miss Susan, rebounding from the Arno and the Roost, called it with a shy sympathetic pride, simply England. The country was at any rate in the house with them as well as in the little green girdle and the little big blue belt. It was in the objects and relics that they handled together and wondered over, finding in them a ground for much inferred importance and invoked romance, stuffing large shores into very small openings and pulling every faded bell rope that might jingle rustily into the pass. They were still here in the presence, at all events, of their common ancestors, as to whom, more than ever before, they took only the best for granted. Was not the best, for that matter, the best, that is, of little melancholy, middling, disenchanted Mar, seated in every stiff chair of the decent old house and stitched into the patchwork of every quaint old counterpane? 200 years of it squared themselves in the brown, panelled parlour, creaked patiently on the wide staircase and broomed herbaceously in the red-walled garden. There was nothing that everyone had ever done before and been at Mar that a Thrush hadn't done it and been it. Yet they wanted more of a picture, and had talked themselves into the fancy of it. There were portraits, half a dozen, comparatively recent. They were called 1800s comparatively recent, and something of a trial to a descendant who had copied Titan at the Pity. But they were curious of a detail, and would like to people a little more thickly in their backward face, to set it up behind their chairs with a small screen embossed with their fingers. They threw off theories in small imaginations, and almost convinced themselves engaged in researches all of which made for pomp and circumstance. Their desire was to discover something, and emboldened by the broader sweep of wing of her companion, Miss Susan herself was not afraid of discovering something bad. Miss Amy it was who had first remarked, as a warning, that this is what it might all lead to. It was she, moreover, whom they owed the formula that, had anything very bad ever happened at Mar, they should be very sorry if a thrush hadn't been in it. This is the highest point at which Miss Susan's good spirit had reached its highest point, she had declared, with her odd breathless laugh, a prolonged, an alarmed, or alarming rasp, that she should really be quite ashamed. And so they rested a while, not saying quite how far that they were prepared to go in crime, not giving the matter a name. But there would have been little doubt for an observer that each supposed the other to mean that she did not only draw the line at murder, but stretch it so she could take in, well, gay deception. If Miss Susan could ever conceivably had asked whether Don Juan had ever touched at that port, Miss Amy would to a certainty have wanted to know by way of answer at what port he had not touched. It was only unfortunately true that no one of the portraits of gentlemen looked at all like him, and no one of these ladies suggested one of his victims. At last, none the less, the cousins had a find, came upon a box odds and ends, mainly documentary, partly printed matter, newspapers and pamphlets yellow and grey with time, and for the rest, epistolary, several packets of letters faded and scarcely decipherable, but clearly sorted for preservation and tied, with sprigged ribbon of a faraway fashion, into little groups. Mar, below ground, is solidly formed, underlaid with great straddling cellars, solid and dry, that are like them groined crypts of churches, and that they present themselves to the meagre modern conception as the treasure chambers of stout merchants as bankers as in the old bustling days. A recess in the thickness of one of the walls had yielded up, on resolute investigation, that of the local youth employed for odd jobs, and whom happened to explore in this direction of his own account, a collection of rusty superflights, among which the small chest in question had been dragged to light. It produced, of course, an instant impression and figured a discovery, though indeed as rather a deceptive one in its being, when forced open, nothing better to show, at the best, than a quantity of rather illegible correspondence. The good ladies and then naturally for the moment had a fluttered hope of old golden guineas, a miser's hoard, perhaps even a hateful of those foreign coins, of old-fashioned romance, ducats, doubloons, pieces of eight, as are sometimes found to have come hiding from overseas in ancient ports. But they had to accept their disappointment, which they sought to do by making the best of the papers, by agreeing, in their own words, to regard them as wonderful. Well, they were, doubtless, wonderful, which didn't prevent them, however, from appearing to be, on superficial inspection, also a rather weary labyrinth, baffling, at any rate, to Mrs. Susan's unpractised eyes. The little pale ribbon packets were, for several evenings, round the fire, while she luxuriously dozed, taken in hand by Mrs. Amy, with the result on that a certain occasion when, towards 9 o'clock, Miss Susan woke up, she found her fellow labourer fast asleep. A slightly irritated confession of ignorance of the Gothic character was the further consequence, and the upshot of this, in turn, was the idea of appeal to Mr. Pattern. Mr. Pattern was the vicar, and was known to interest himself, as such, in the ancient animals of Mar, in addition to which, and its being even sometimes held a little to his sense of the affairs of the hour, was sometimes sacrificed to such inquiries. But he was a gentleman with a humour of his own, a flushed face, a bushy eyebrow, and a black wide-eyed worn socially askew. He will tell us, he said, Amy Frush, if there's anything in them. Yet if it should be, Susan suggested, anything we mayn't like? Well, that's just what I'm thinking of, returned Mrs. Amy, in her offhand way. If it's anything we shouldn't know, we've only to tell him not to tell us. Oh, certainly, said mild Miss Susan. She took it upon herself to even give that warning when, on the invitation of our friends, Mr. Pattern came to tea to talk things over, Miss Amy sitting by and raising no protest, but distinctly promising herself that, whatever there might be to know, and however objectionable, she would privately get it out of their initiator. She found herself already hoping that it would be something too bad for her cousin, too bad for anyone else at all to know, and that it most properly might remain between them. Mr. Pattern, at sight of the papers, exclaimed, perhaps a trifle ambiguously, and by no means clerically, my eye, what a lark! And retired, after 3 cups of tea, in an overcoat bulging with his spoil. End of chapter 1. Recording by Anthony Orr. The third person. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Orr. The Third Person by Henry James. Chapter 2. At 10 o'clock that evening the pair separated, as usual, on the upper landing, outside their respective doors, for the night. But Miss Amy had hardly set down her candle on her dressing table before she was startled by an extraordinary sound, which appeared to proceed not only from her companion's room, but from her companion's throat. It was something she would describe, as she ever described it, as between a gurgle and a shriek, and it brought Amy fresh, after an interval of stricken silence that gave her just enough time to say to herself, "Someone's under the bed," breathlessly and bravely back to the landing. She had not reached it, however, before her neighbour, bursting in, met in and stayed her. "There's someone in my room." They held each other. "But who?" "A man." "Under the bed?" "No, just standing there." They continued to hold each other, but they rocked. "Standing? Where? How?" "Why, right in the middle, before my dressing glass." Amy's blanched face by this time matched her maid's, but its terror was entranced by speculation. "To look at himself?" "No, with his back to it. To look at me." Poor Susan just audibly breathed. "To keep me off," she quavered, "in strange clothes, of another age, with his head on one side." Amy wondered. On one side? Awfully, the refugee declared while, clinging together, they sounded each other. This, somehow, for Mrs. Amy, was a convincing touch, and on it, after a moment, she was capable of the effort of darting back to close her own door. "You'll remain then with me." "Oh," Miss Susan wavered with deep assent, quite as if she had been a slangy person, she would have ejaculated, "Rather." So they spent the night together, with the assumption thus marked, from the first, both that it would have been vain to confront their visitor, as they didn't even pretend to each other that they would have confronted a housebreaker, and that by leaving the place at his mercy nothing worse could happen than had already happened. It was Miss Amy's approaching the door again with intent ear, and after a hush that represented between them a deep and extraordinary interchange, that it was this that put them promptly face to face with the real character of the occurrence. "Ah," Miss Susan, still under her breath, pompously explained, "it isn't anyone." "No." Her partner was already able magnificently to take her up. "It isn't anyone who can really hurt us," Miss Susan completed her thought. And Miss Amy, as it proved, had been so indescribably prepared at this thought, before morning, had in the strangest, finest way, made for herself an admirable place within them. The person was the elder of our pair, had seen in her room, just simply was not anyone in from outside. He was a different thing altogether. Miss Amy had felt it as soon as she heard her friend cry and become aware of her commotion, at all events, as she saw Miss Susan's face. That was all. And there it was. There had been something hitherto wanting, they felt, to their small fate and importance. It was present now, and they were as handsomely conscious of it as if they had previously missed it. The element in question, then, was a third person in their association, a hovering present for the dark hours, a figure that with its head very much, too much on one side, could be trusted to look at them out of unnatural places, yet only, it doubtless might be assumed, to look at them. They had at last had what things to be had in an old house, what too many things had happened, where the very walls they touched and floors they trod could have told secrets and named names, where every surface was a blurred mirror of life and death, of the endured, the remembered, the forgotten. Yes, the place was but they stopped at using the word, and by morning, wonderful to say, they were used to it. They had quite lived into it. Not only this indeed, but they had lived their prompt theory. There was a connection between finding the box in the vault and the appearance in Miss Susan's room. The heavy air of the past had been stirred by the bringing to light of what had so long been hidden. The communications of the papers to Mr. Patten had had its effect. They faced each other in the morning at breakfast over the certainty that their cuirass innate was a sign of the violated secret of these relics. No matter. For the sake of the secret they would put up with his attention, and this in them was the most beautiful of all. They must, though he was such an addiction to their grandeur, keep him quite to themselves. Other people might hear of him, what he was not in the letters, but they should never hear of him. They were not afraid that either of the maids should see him. He was not a matter for maids. The question was indeed whether, should he keep it up long, they themselves might find it they could really live with him. Yet perhaps in his keeping it up would be just what really made them indifferent. They turned these things over, but spent the next nights together, and on the third day, in the course of their afternoon walk, described at a distance the vicar, who, as soon as he saw them, waved his arms violently, either as a warning or as a joke, and came more than half way to meet them. It was in the middle, or what passed for such, of the big, bleak, blank, melancholy square of Mar, a public place, as it were, of such an absurd capacity for a crowd, with the great ivy-mantled choir and stopped transept of a noble planned church telling of how many centuries ago it had, for its part, given up growing. Why, my dear ladies, cried Mr. Patten as he approached, do you know what, of all things in the world, I seem to make out for you from your funny old letters? Then, as he waited, extremely on their guard now, neither more nor less, if you please, than one of your ancestors in the last century, Mr. Cuthbert Thrush, it would seem, by name, was hanged. They never knew afterwards which of the two had found composure, found even dignity, to respond. And pray, Mr. Patten, for what? Ah, that's just what I don't yet get a hold of. But if you don't mind me digging away, and the vicious, bushy, jolly brows turned from one lady to the other, I think I can run it to earth. They hanged in those days, you know, he added as he had seen something in their faces, for almost any trifle. Oh, I hope it wasn't a trifle, Miss Susan strangely tittered. Yes, of course one would say that, while he was about it. Well, as it had been, as they say. Mr. Patten laughed, rather for a sheep than for a lamb. Did they hang at the time for a sheep? Miss Amy wonderingly asked. It made our frame last. The question's whether he did. We'll soon find out. Upon my word, you know, I can quite want to myself. I'm awfully busy, but I think I can promise you that you shall hear. You don't mind, he insisted. I think we could bear anything, Miss Susan gazed at her, on this, as for reference and appeal. And what is he, after all, at this time of day, to us? Her kinswoman, meeting the eyeglass fixedly, spoke with gravity. Oh, an ancestor's always an ancestor. Well, said and well felt, dear lady, the vicar declared. Whatever they have made done is done. It isn't everyone, Miss Amy replied, that has them to be ashamed of. We're not ashamed, yes, Miss Thrush jerked out. Let me promise then that you shan't be. Only for I am busy, said Mr. Patten. Give me time. Ah, but we want the truth, they cried with high emphasis as he quitted them. They were much excited now. He answered by pulling up and turning round short, as his professional character had been challenged. Isn't it just in the truth, and the truth only, that I deal? Just that they recognised as much of a love of a joke, and so they were left there together in the pleasant, if slightly overdone, void of the square, which wore at moments the air of a conscious demonstration, intended as an appeal, of the shrinkage of the population of Mar to a solitary cat. They walked on after a little, but they waited till the vicar was ever so far away before they spoke again, all the more that their doing so must bring them once more to a pause. Then they had long looked. Hanged, said Miss Amy, yet almost exultantly. This was, however, because it was not she who had seen it. That's why his head. But Miss Susan faltered. Her companion took it in. Oh, it's such a dreadful twist. It is dreadful, Miss Susan at last dropped, speaking as if she had been present at least 20 executions. There had been no saying, at any rate, what it didn't evoke from Mrs. Amy. It breaks their neck, she contributed after a moment. Miss Susan looked away. That's why, I suppose, the head's turned so fearfully awry. It's a most particular effect. So particular, it might have seemed, that it made them silent afresh. Well then, I hope he killed someone, Miss Amy broke out at last. Her companion thought, wouldn't it depend on whom? No, she returned with her characteristic briskness, a briskness that set them again into motion. That Mr. Patten was so tremendously busy was evident indeed, as even by the end of the week he had nothing more to impart. The old thing meanwhile came up again, on the Sunday afternoon, as the younger Miss Thrush had been quite confident that, from one day to the other, it must. They went intermittently to evening church, on the close of which supper was postponed, and Miss Susan, on this occasion, ready the first, patiently awaited her mate at the foot of the stairs. Miss Amy at last came down, buttoning a glove, rustling the tail of her frock, and looking, at her kinswoman always thought, conspicuously young and smart. There was no one at Marsh, she held, who dressed like her, and Miss Amy, it must be owned, had also settled to this view of Miss Susan. They had taken it in a different spirit. Dusk had gathered, but our frugal pair were always tardy lighters, and the grey close of the day, in which the elder lady, on a high-backed hall chair, sat with hands patiently folded, had for all cheer the subdued glow, always subdued, of the small fire in the drawing-room, visible through a door that stood open. Into the drawing-room Miss Amy passed in search of the prayer-book. She had laid it down there after morning church, and from it, after a minute, without this volume, she returned to her companion. There was something in the movement that spoke, spoke for a moment so largely that nothing more was said till, with a quick unanimity, they got themselves straight out of the house. There, before the door, in the cold, still twilight of the winter's end, while the church bells rang and the windows of the great choir showed up across the empty square faintly red, they had it out again. But it was Miss Susan this time who had to bring it. He's there? Before the fire, with his back to it. Well, now you see, Miss Susan explained with elation, as if her friend had hitherto doubted to her. Yes, I see, and what you mean. Miss Amy was deeply thoughtful. About his head? It is on one side, Miss Amy went on. It makes him. She considered, but she felt as if still in his presence. It makes him awful, Miss Susan murmured. The way, she softly moaned, he looks at you. Miss Amy, with a glance, met this recognition. Yes, doesn't he? Then her eyes attached themselves to the red windows of the church. But it means something. The Lord knows what it means, her associate gloomily sighed. Then, after an instant, did he move? Miss Susan asked. No, and I didn't. Oh, I did, Miss Susan declared, recalling to her more precipitous retreat. I mean, I took my time. I waited. To see him fade? Miss Amy, for a moment, said nothing. He doesn't fade, that's it. Oh, then you did move, her relative rejoined. Again, for a little while, she was silent. One has to. But I don't know what really happened. Of course I came back to you. What I mean is that I took him thoroughly in. He's young, she added. But he's bad, Miss Susan said. He's handsome, Miss Amy brought out after a moment. She showed himself prepared to continue. Splendidly. Splendidly? With his neck broken and that terrible look? It's just the look that makes him so. It's the wonderful eyes. They mean something, Amy Frush brooded. She spoke decision, of which Amy presently betrayed the effect. And what do they mean? Her friend stared again at the glooming windows of St. Thomas of Canterbury. That it's time we should get to the church. End of chapter 2. Recording by Anthony Orr. The third person. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Orr. The curate that evening did duty alone, but on the morrow the vicar called and, as soon as he got into the room, let them again have it. He was hanged for smuggling. They stood there before him, almost cold in their surprise, and diffusing an air which, somehow, this misdemeanour sounded out the coarsest of all. Smuggling, Miss Susan disappointedly echoed, as if it presented itself to the first chill of their apprehension that it had only been vulgar. Ah, but they hand for it freely, you know, and I was an idiot for not taking it, in his case, for granted. If a man swung hereabouts, it was mostly for that. Don't you know that it's on that we stand today, such as we are, on the fact of what our bold, bad forefathers were not afraid of? It's in the floors we walk on and under the roofs that cover us. They smuggled so hard they never had time to do anything else. And if they broke a head not their own, it was only in the awkwardness of landing their brandy kegs. I mean, dear ladies, good Patton wound up, no disrespect to your forefathers, when I tell like that, as I have been rather supposing like that all the rest of us, you are aware, they conveniently live by it. Miss Susan wondered, visibly almost doubted. Gentlefolks? It was the gentlefolks who were the worst. They must have been the bravest, Miss Amy interjected. She had listened to their visitor's free explanation with a rapid return of colour. And since they lived by it, they also died for it. There's nothing at all to be said against them. I quite agree with you, the vicar said. For all my cloth, I even go so far as to say, shocking as you may think me, that we owe them, in our shabby little shrunken present, the sense of a bustling background, a sort of undertone of romance. They give us, he humorously kept it up, verging perilously near for his cloth, upon positive paradox, our little handful of legend and our small possibility of ghosts. He paused an instant, with his lighter pulpit manner, but the ladies exchanged no look. They were in fact, already, with an immense revulsion, carried quite as far away. Every penny in this place, really, that hasn't been earned by subtler, not nobler arts in our own virtuous time, and though it's a pity there are not more of every penny in this place we picked up, somehow, by a clever trick, at the risk of to your neck, when the backs of the king's officers were turned. It's shocking, you know, what I'm saying to you, or I wouldn't say to everyone, but I think of some of the shabby old things about us, who represent such a pickings, with a sort of sneaking kindness, as our relics are of our heroic age. What are we now? We were at any rate devils of followers then. Susan Frush considered it all solemnly, struggling with the spell of this evocation. We must forget that they were wicked. Never, Mr. Patton. Thank you, dear friend, for reminding me. Only I'm worse than they. But would you do it? Murder a coastguard? The vicar scratched his head. I hope, Miss Amy said rather surprisingly, you'd defend yourself. And she gave Miss Susan a superior glance. I would, she distinctly added. Her companion anxiously looked up. Would you defraud the revenue? Miss Amy hesitated but a moment. Then, with a strange laugh, which she remarked, however, by turning instantly away, yes, she remarkably declared. Their visitor at this, amused and amusing, eagerly seized her arm. Then may I count you on the stroke of midnight to help you? To help you? To land the new Tauchnitz. She met the proposal at one whose fancy had kindled, while her cousin watched them as if they had suddenly improvised into a drawing-room charade. A service of danger? Under the cliff, when you see the lugger stand in. Armed to the teeth? Yes, but invisibly. Your old waterproof? Mine is new. I'll take Susan's. This good lady, however, had her reserves. Mayn't one of them, all the same, here and here, have been sorry? Mr. Patten wondered. For the jobs he muffed. For the wrong. It was wrong, he did. One of them? She had gone too far, for the vicar suddenly looked as if he had divined into a question of reference. They had become, however, as promptly unanimous in meeting this danger, as to which Susan in particular showed an inspired presence of mind. Two of them, she sweetly smiled. May not Amy and I vicariously repent? Said Mr. Patten. That depends, for in the true horror of Mar, on how you show it. Oh, we shan't show it, Miss Amy cried. Ah, then, Mr. Patten returned. Through atonement, to be efficient, I suppose to be public. You may do penance in secret as much as you please. Well, I shall do it, said Susan flushed. Again, by something in her tone, the vicar's attention appeared to be caught. Have you then in view a particular form of atonement? She coloured now, glaring rather helplessly in spite of herself at her companion. Oh, if you're sincere, you'll always find one. Amy came to her assistance. The way she often treats me has made her, though there's no harm at all in her, familiar with remorse. Mayn't we, at any rate, the younger lady continues, now have our letters back? And the vicar left them with the assurance that they should receive the bundle on the morrow. They are indeed so at one as to shrouding their mystery that no explicit agreement, no exchangement of vows needed to be passed between them. They only settled down, from this moment, an unshared possession of their secret, an economy in the use, as may even be said, the enjoyment of it, that was part of their general instinct and habit of thrift. It had been the disposition, the practice, the necessity of each to keep, fairly indeed to clutch, everything that, as they often phrased it, came their way. For this was not the first time such an influence had determined for them that an affirmation of property objects to which ridicule, suspicion, and other such inconvenience might attach. It was their simple philosophy that one never knew what service an odd object might not be, and there were days now on which they felt themselves to be made a better bargain with their aunt's executors than was witnessed in those law papers which they had first timorously regarded as a record of advantages taken of them in matters of detail. They had got, in short, more than was vulgarly, more than even was shrewdly supposed, such an indescribable unearned increment, as much might scarce more be divulged than a dread as a delight. They grew together, old maidishly, in a suspicious, invidious grasp of the idea that a dread of their own, and blissfully not, of course, that a failure of any essential supply, might, on nearer acquaintances, positively turn to a delight. Upon such attempt consideration of it, at all events, they found themselves embarking upon their last interview with Mr. Patten, an understanding conveyed between them in no redundancy of discussion, no flippant repetitions, nor profane recurrences, yet resting on a sense of added margin, of appropriated history, of liberties taken with time and space, that would leave them both prepared for the worst and for the best. The best would be that something would turn out their place to their advantage, might prove to be hidden about the place. The worst would be that they might find themselves to have grown to be depending only on too much excitement. They found themselves amazingly reconciled, on Mr. Patten's information, to the particular character that thus fixed their visitor. They knew by tradition and fiction that even the highwaymen of the same picturesque age were often gallant gentlemen. Therefore a smuggler, by such a measure, fairly belonged to the aristocracy of crime. When their packet of documents came back from the vicarage, Miss Amy, to whom her associate continued to leave them, took them once more in hand, and with that effect afresh of discouragement and languor, a headachy sense of faded ink, of strange spelling and crabbed characters, of allusions she couldn't follow and parts she couldn't match. She pasted the tattered papers piously together, wrapping them tenderly in pieces of old figured silken stuff. Then, as solemnly as they had been archived or statute or title deeds, laid them away in one of the several small cupboards lodged in the thickness of the wainscoted walls. What really most sustained our friends in all ways was their consciousness of having, after all, and so contrariwise to what appeared, a man in the house. It removed them from that category of the manlessness in which no lady really lapses until every issue is closed. Their visitor was an issue, at least to the imagination, and they arrived finally, under provocation, at intensities of flutter in which they finally felt themselves so compromised by his hooverings that they know they could only consider with relief the fact of nobody's knowing. The real complication, indeed, was at first was knowing for quite some weeks after their talk with Mr. Pattern that the hoverings quite ceased, a circumstance that brought home to them in some degree a sense of indiscretion and indelicacy. They hadn't mentioned him, no, but they had come perilously near it, and they had doubtless at any rate too recklessly let in the light on the old buried and sheltered things, old sorrows and shames. They roamed about the house themselves at times, fitly and singly. When each supposed the other out or engaged, they paused and lingered, like soundless apparitions in corners, doorways, passages, and sometimes suddenly met, in these experiments, with a suppressed start and a mute confession. They talked of him practically never, but each knew how the other, in all the more that it was. Oh yes, unmistakably, in a manner different from her own. They were together, none the less, in feeling, while week after week he failed again to show, and if they had been guilty of blowing with an effective sacrilege on old gathering silvery ashes. It frankly came out for them that, possessed as they so strangely, yet so ridiculous when, they should be able to settle to nothing till their consciousness were yet again confirmed. Whatever the subject of it might have been, for fear or favour, profit or loss, he had taken the taste for everything else. He had converted them into wandering guests. At last, one day, with nothing they could perceive to have determined it, the change came. Change, as the previous splash of the stillness had come, by the pale testimony of Miss Susan. She waited till breakfast to speak of it, or Miss Amy waited, rather, to hear her, for she showed during the meals her fate of consorted commotion that her comrade already knew and must, when the game loyally played, serve as a preface to his disclosure. The younger of their friends really watched the elder over their teary toast, for seeing her for the first time as partially tortuous, suspected in her some intention of keeping back what had happened. What had happened that the image of the hangman had reappeared in the night, yet only after they had moved together in the drawing-room did Miss Amy learn the facts. I was beside the bed, in that low chair, about, since Miss Amy must know, to take off my right shoe. I had noticed nothing before, and had the time to partly to undress, had got into my wrapper. So suddenly, as I had happened to look, there he was, and there, said Student Thrush, he stayed. But where do you mean? In the high-backed chair, the old flowered chintz, ear chair beside the chimney. All night? And you in your wrapper? This as if this image almost challenged her credulity. Why didn't you go to bed? Miss Amy inquired. With a person in the room? Her friend wonderingly asked, adding an instant after with positive pride. I never broke the spell. And you didn't freeze to death? Yes, almost. Say nothing of not having slept. I can assure you, one wink. I shut my eyes for long stretches, but whenever I opened them he was still there, and I never for a moment lost consciousness. Miss Amy gave a groan of conscientious sympathy. So that is why you're feeling, of course, now half dead. Her companion said to look at the chimney-glass, a wan, glazed eye. I dare say I am looking impossible. Miss Amy, after an instant, found herself still conscientious. You are. Her own eyes stared into the glass, lingering while she lost herself in thought. Really, she reflected with a certain dryness, if that's the kind of thing it's to be, there would seem, in a word, no withstanding for it either. Why, did she afterwards ask herself in secret, should the restless spirit of a dead adventure have addressed itself, in its trouble, to such a person as her queer, quaint, inefficient housemate? It wasn't here, she dumbly and somewhat sorely argued, that an unappealed soul of the old race should show a confidence. To this conviction she was the more directed by the sense of Susan had, in relation to the preference shown, vain and foolish complacencies. She had her idea of what, in their predicament, should be, as she sometimes called it, done, and that was a question that Amy from this time began to nurse the small aggression of not so much having discussed with her. She had certainly, poor Miss Thrush, a new and obscure reticence, and since she wouldn't speak first she should have the silence to her fill. Miss Amy, however, peopled the silence with conjectural visions of kinswoman's secret communication. Miss Susan, it was true, showed nothing, not on any particular occasion, more than usual, but this was just a part of her very felicity that had begun to harden and uplift her. Days and nights hereupon elapsed, without bringing felicity of any order to Amy Thrush. She still had no emotions, it was, she suspected, because Susan had them all, and it would she has been preposterous not to be pathetic. She proceeded rapidly to hug the option that Susan was selfish, and even something of a sneak. Politeness between them still reigned, but confidence had flown, and its place was taken by open ceremonies and confessed precautions. Miss Susan looked blank but resigned, which maintained again unfortunately, whose superior air and the presumption of her duplicity. Her manner was of not knowing where her friend's shoe pinched, but it might have been taken by a jaundiced eye for surprise at the challenge of her monopoly. The unexpected resistance of her nerves was indeed a wonder. Was this the result, even for a shaky old woman, of shocks sufficiently repeated? Miss Amy brooded was on the rich inference that, though the first of them didn't prostrate and the rest didn't undermine, one might keep them up as easily as, well, say an unavowed acquaintance or a private commerce of letters. She was startled at the comparison into which she fell. But what was this but an intrigue like another? And fancy Susan carrying one on! The history of the long night hours in the pair the two chairs kept before her, for was it always present, the extraordinary measure? Was the situation it involved only grotesque, or was it quite grimly grand? It struck her as both, but that was the case with all their situations. Would it be in herself, at any rate, to show them a front? She put herself such questions till he was tired of them. A few good moments of her own would have cleared the air. Luckily, they were to come. End of chapter 3. Recording by Anthony Orr. Of the third person. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Orr. It was on a Sunday morning in April, a day brimming over with the turn of the season. She had gone into the garden before church, and they cherished alike, with pottering intimacies and opposed theories and a wonderful apparatus of old gloves and trowels and spuds and little botanical cards on sticks. This featured their establishment, where they could still differ without fear and agree without diplomacy, and which now, with its vernal promise, threw beauty and gloom and light and space and a great good-natured ease into their wavering scales. She was dressed for church, but when Susan, who had, touching a window, seen her wandering, stooping, examining, touching, appeared in the doorway to signify a like readiness, she suddenly felt her intention checked. Thank you, she said, drawing her near. I think that, though I've dressed, I won't, after all, go. Please, therefore, proceed without me. Miss Susan fixed her. You're not well? Not particularly. I shall be better. The morning's so perfect here. Are you really ill? Indisposed, but not enough so, thank you, for you to stay with me. Then it has come on but just now? No, I had felt not quite fit when I dressed. But it won't do. Yet you'll stay out here? Miss Amy looked about. It will depend. Her friend paused long enough to have asked what it would depend on, but abruptly, after this contemplation, turned instead and merely throwing over her shoulder, At least take care of yourself, went rustling in her stiffest Sunday fashion about her business. Miss Amy, left alone, as she clearly desired to be, lingered a while in the garden, where the sense of things was somehow made more delicious by the sweet, vain sounds from the church tower, but by the end of 10 minutes she had returned to the house. The sense of things was not delicious there, for what it had last come to was that, as they had thought of each other what they couldn't say, all their contacts were hard and false. The real wrong was in what Susan thought, as to what she was too much too proud and too sore to undeceive her. Miss Amy went vaguely to the drawing-room. They sat as usual after church, at their early Sunday dinner, face to face, but little passed between them save that Mrs. Amy felt better, and that the curate had preached, and that no one else had stayed away, and that everybody had asked why Amy had. Amy, hereupon, satisfied everyone by feeling well enough to go in the afternoon, on which occasion, on the other hand, and for reasons even less luminous than those had operated with her mate in the morning, Miss Susan remained within. Her comrade came back late, having, after church, paid visits, and found her, as daylight faded, seated in the drawing-room, placid and dressed, but without so much as a Sunday book. The place contained whole shelves of such reading, in her hand. She looked as if a visitor had just left her that Amy put the question. Has anyone called? Dear no, I've been quite alone. This again was indirect, and it instantly determined for Miss Amy a conviction. A conviction that, on her also sitting down, and just as she was, and in a silence that prolonged itself, promoted in its turn another determination. The April dusk gathered, and still, without further speech, the companions sat there. But at last Miss Amy sitting down, not quite her commonest. This morning he came, while you were at church. I suppose it must have been really. Therefore, of course, I can't know it. What I was moved to stay at home for. She spoke now, out of her contentment, as if to oblige her with explanations. But it was strange how Miss Susan met her. You stay at home for him? I don't. She fairly laughed at the triviality of the idea. Miss Amy was naturally struck by it, and after an instant even nettled. Then why did you do this afternoon? Oh, it wasn't for that, Miss Susan lightly quavered. She made a distinction. I really wasn't well. At this her cousin brought it out. But he had been with you? My dear child, said Susan, launched unexpectedly even to herself. He's with me so often that if I put myself out for him. But at the sight of something that showed through the twilight in her French face, she pulled herself up. Amy spoke, however, with studied stillness. You ceased then to put yourself out? You gave me, you remember, an instance of how you once did? And she tried, on her side, a laugh. Oh, yes, that was it at first. But then I've seen a lot of him since. Do you mean you hadn't? Susan said. Then as her companion only sat looking at her. Has this really been the first time since we last talked? Miss Amy for a minute said nothing. You actually believe me, to be enjoying on your own account what I enjoy? How couldn't I, at the very least? Miss Susan cried. So grand and strange as you must allow to say you struck me? Amy hesitated. I hope I sometimes struck you as decent. But with a touch that, in her friend's almost amused preoccupation with the simple fact, happily fell short. You've only been waiting for what didn't come. Miss Amy coloured in the dark. It came, I tell you, today. Better late than never. And Miss Susan got up. Amy first sat looking. It's because you thought that you had ground for jealousy that you've been extraordinary. Poor Susan, at this, quite bounced about. Jealousy? It was a tone, never heard from her before, that brought Amy fresh to her feet. So that for a minute, in the unlighted room, where in honour of the spring there had been no fire, and the evening chill had gathered, they stood as enemies. It lasted, fortunately, even long enough to give one of them time suddenly to find it horrible. But why should we quarrel now? Amy broke out in a different voice. Susan was not too alienated quickly enough to meet it. It is rather wretched. Now when we're equal, Amy went on. Yes, I suppose we are. Then, however, as if just to attenuate the situation, Susan had her last lapse from grace. They say, you know, that is why a woman quarrel is usually about a man. Amy recognised it, but also with a reserve. Well then, let there first be one. And don't you call him? No, Amy declared and turned away, while her compassion showed her with a vain wonder for what she could case that expected. Their identity of privilege was thus established, but it is not certain with the air which she indicated that the subject had better drop didn't press down for an instant her side of the balance. She knew that she knew most about men. The subject did drop for the time, it being agreed between them that neither should, from the hour, accept the other any confession or report. They would treat all occurrences now as not worth mentioning. A course easy to pursue from the moment the suspicion jealousy had, on each side, been so completely laid to rest. They had led their life for a month or two on the smooth side of taking everything for granted. By the end of which time, however, try as they would, they had set up no question that, while a pair of gentlewomen living together only must meet, could successfully pretend to take the place that of Cuthbert Thrush. The spring softened and deepened, reached out its hand bronze and scattered its shy graces. The earth broke, the air stirred, with emancipations that were untouched voices of the path. Our friends bent their backs in the garden and their noses over its symptoms. They opened their windows in the mildness and tracked it in the lanes and by the hedges. Yet the plant of conversation between them markedly failed to renew itself with the rest. It was not indeed the mildness was not within them as well as without. All asperity, at least, had melted away, and they were more than ever pleased with their general acquisition, which at the winter's end seemed to give out more of its old secrets, to hum, however faintly, with more of its old echoes, to creak, here and there, with the expiring throb of old aches. The deepest sweetness of the spring at Mar was just in its being this way of attestation of age and rest. The place never seemed to have lived and lingered so long when kind nature, like a maiden blessed to a crone, laid rosy hands upon its grizzled hair. Then the new season was light held up all to show the dignity of the years, but also all the wrinkles and scars. The good ladies in whom we are interested changed, at any rate, with the happy days, and it finally came out that not only that the invidious note has dropped, but that it had positively turned to music. The whole tone of the time made so for tenderness that it really seemed at moments that they were sad for each other. They had their grounds at last, each found them in their own consciousness, but it was at least weighted, on the one hand, to be sure that she could speak without offence. Fortunately, at last, the tense cord snapped. The old churchyard at Mar is still liberal. It does its in-memories upmost to people, with names and dates and memories and eulogies, with generations foreshortened and confounded. The high empty table at which grand old cripple of the church looks down over the low wall. It serves in an easy thoroughfare, and the stranger finds himself pausing in it with a sense of respect and compassion for the great maimed, ivied shoulders, as the image strikes him, of stone. Miss Susan and Miss Amy were strangers enough to still have sunk down one May morning on the sun-warmed tablet of an ancient tomb, and have remained looking at them in the sort of ancient peace. Their walks were all pointless now, as if they always stopped and turned for unconfessed want of interest before reaching their object. That object presented itself at every start at the same to each, but they each came back too often without getting near it. This morning, strangely, on the return, almost in sight of the door, they were more in presence of it than they had ever been, and they seemed fairly to touch it when Susan said at last, quite in the air and with no trace of reference. I hope you don't mind, dearest, if I'm awfully sorry for you. Oh, I know it, Amy returned. I felt it. But what does it do for us? Then Amy saw, with wonder and pity, how little resentment for penetration or patronage she had to fear, and out of what a depth of sentiment similar to her own her companion helplessly spoke. You're sorry for me? Amy at first only looked at her with tired eyes, pushing her hand around what remained on her arm. Dear old girl, you might have told it me before, she went on as she took everything in. Though, after all, haven't we each really known it? Well, said Susan, we've waited. We could only wait. Then if we waited together, her friend returned, that has helped us. Yes, to keep him in his place. Who would ever believe in him? Miss Susan wearily wondered, if it wasn't for you and for me. Not doubting of each other? Her companion took her up. And yet, that wouldn't be a creature. It's lucky for us, said Miss Amy, that we don't doubt. Oh, if we did, we shouldn't be sorry. No, except selfishly, for ourselves. I am, assure you, for myself, it has made me older. But luckily, at any rate, we should trust each other. We do, said Miss Susan. We do, Miss Amy repeated. They lingered a little on that. But except as Mum making feel older, what has it done? There it is! And it is as though we'd kept it in its place, Miss Amy continued. He has also kept us in ours. We've lived with it, she declared in melancholy justice, and we wondered at first if we could, she ironically added. Well, isn't it just what we feel now, that we can't any longer? No, it must stop, and I've had my idea, said Miss Susan Frush. Oh, I assure you I've had mine, her cousin responded. Then if you want to act, don't mind me. Because you certainly won't mind me? No, I suppose not. Well, Amy sighs, if merely from this, relief had at last come. Her comrade echoed it, and they were made side by side, and nothing could have had more urgency than what was assumed, alike in what had been said and what had been kept back. There would have been at least in their favour for a question of their case, that each, charged dejectedly with her own experience, took, on the part of the other, the extraordinary, the ineffable, and in fact all for granted. They never named it again, as you see it was not easy to name. The whole matter shrouded itself in personal discriminations and privacies. The comparison of notes had become a thing impossible. What was definite was that they had lived into their queer story, passed through it as through an observed, a studied, eclipse of the usual, a period of reclusion, a financial, social, or moral crisis, and now only desired to live out of it again. The questioner we have been supposing might have even fancied that again, on her side, had hoped for something which she had finally perceived and was never to give, which would have been exactly, moreover, the core of her secret and the explanation of her reserve. They, at least, as the business stood, put each other to no test, and, if they were in fact disillusioned and disappointed, came together, after their long blight, solidly on that. It fully appeared that between them they felt a great deal older. When they got up from their sun-warmed slab, however, reminding each other of luncheon, it was with a visible increase of ease, and with Miss Susan's hand drawn, for the walk home in Miss Amy's arm. Thus was the idea that each continued unspoken and ungrudged. It was each wished the other to try their own first, from which it might have been gathered that they alike presented difficulty and with entailed expense. The great question remained, what then did he want? Ablution, peace, rest, his final reprieve? Merely to say that they saw no further than on the way that they had already come? What were they at last to do with him? What could they give him that he would take? The ideas they respectively nursed still bore no fruit, and at the end of another month Miss Susan was frankly anxious about Miss Amy. Miss Amy has freely admitted that people must have begun to notice strange marks in them and look for reasons. They were changed. They must change back. End of chapter 4. Recorded by Anthony Orr. Chapter 5 of the Third Person. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Orr. The Third Person by Henry James. Chapter 5. Yet it was not till one morning at midsummer, on their meeting before breakfast, that the elderly lady fairly attacked the younger lady's last entrancement. Poor Susan, Miss Amy had said to herself as her cousins came into the room, and a moment later she brought out, for her very pity, her appeal. What then is yours? My idea? It was clearly, at last, a vague comfort to Miss Susan to be asked. Yet her answer was desolate. Oh, it's no use. But how do you know? Why, I tried it 10 days ago, and I thought at first it had answered. But he hasn't. He's back again. Wan, tired, Miss Susan gave it up. Back again. Miss Amy, after the one long odd looks that had now become the more frequent form of intercourse, thought that over. And just the same? Worse. Dear Miss Amy, clearly knowing what that meant. Then what do you do? Her friend brought it roundly out. I made my sacrifice. Miss Amy thought, still more deeply interrogative, hesitated. But of what? Why, of my little all. Or almost. The almost seemed to puzzle Miss Amy, who, moreover, plainly had no clue to the property or attribute, so cried, Your little all? £20. Money! Miss Amy gasped. Her tone produced on her little companion's part a wonder great as turn as her own. What then is yours to give? My idea! It's not to give! At the finer pride that broke out in this, poor Susan's blankness flushed. What then is it to do? But Miss Amy's bewilderment outlasted her reproach. Do you mean he takes money? The Chancellor of Exchequer does. For conscience. Her friend's exploits shone larger. Conscience money? You sent it to the government? Then, while the effect of her surprise her mate looked too much like a fool, Amy melted to kindness. Why, you secretive old thing! Miss Susan presently pulled herself together. When your ancestors robbed the revenue, and his spirit walked for remorse, you pay to get rid of them? I see. And it becomes what the vicar called the atonement by deputy. But what if it isn't remorse? Miss Amy shrewdly asked. But it is, or it seemed to me so. Never to me. Again they searched each other. Then, evidently, with you he's different. Miss Amy looked away. I dare say. So what is your idea, then? Miss Amy thought. I'll tell you only if it works. Then, for God's sakes, try it! Miss Amy, still with averted eyes, and now looking easily wise, continued to think. To try it I'll have to leave you. That's why I've waited so long. Then she fully turned with expression. Can you face 3 days alone? Oh, alone! I wish I ever were. At this her friend, for very compassion, kissed her, for it seemed to have really come out at last, and welcome, that poor Susan was with poor beset. I'll do it, but I must go up to town. Ask me no questions. All I can tell you now is, well, Susan appealed while Amy aggressively fixed her. It's no more remorse than I'm a smuggler. What is it then? It's bravado. And oh, more shocked and scared than anything than that, in the whole business, it yet dropped from her. Wound up poor Susan's share in this agreement, appearing as it did to represent her for a somewhat loose inference. Amy clearly had lights of her own. It was by that their air, accordingly, that she immediately prepared for the first separation that they had yet to suffer, of which the consequence, 2 days later, was that Miss Susan, bowed in the entrance, crept singly, on the return from their parting, up the steep hills that run from the station of Mar, and passed ruefully under the ruined town gate, one of the old deferences, that arches over it. But the still sequel was not for a month. One August night, and when, under the dim stars, they sat together in their little walled garden, they had by this time in general found again, as women only can find, the secret of easy speech, nothing, for the half-hour passed between them. Susan had only sat waiting for a comrade to wake up. Miss Amy had taken of late to interminable dozing, as with forfeits and arrears to recover. She might have been a conservalant from fever-repairing tissue in getting through time. Susan Fresh watched her in the warm dizziness, and the question between them was fortunately at last so simple that she had freedom to think her pretty and similar, and to fear that herself, so unguarded, presented an appearance less graceful. She was impatient, for her need at last come, but she waited, and while she waited she thought. She had already often done so, but the mystery deepened tonight in the stories she was told, as seen by to her, by her companion's frequent relapses. What it had been, 3 weeks before, the effort intense enough to leave behind such trail of fatigue. The marks Shona had shown in the poor girl that morning of the termination of the arranged antiment, for which not 3 days, but 10, without word or sign, to which proved no more than sufficient. It was at an unnatural hour that Amy had turned up, dusty, dishevelled, inscrutable, confessing for the time nothing more than a long night journey. Miss Susan prided herself on playing the game and respected, however tormenting, the conditions. She had her convictions that her friend had been out of the country, she marvelled, thinking of her own old wanderings, and who, whatever she had previously done, had not travelled, could carry off such a flight. The hour had come at last for this person to name her remedy. What determined it was that, as Susan Fresh sat there, she took home the fact that her remedy was at this time not to be questioned. It had acted on her own as not, and Amy, to all appearance, had waited for her to admit it. Well, she was ready when Amy woke immediately to meet her eyes and to show after a moment in doing so a vision of what was in her mind. So what was it now? Susan finally asked. My idea? Is it possible that you've not guessed? Oh, you're deeper, much deeper, Susan sighed than I. Amy didn't contradict that. She seemed, indeed, placidly enough to take it for truth. But now she presently spoke as if the difference, after all, it didn't matter now. Happily for us today, isn't it so? Or our case is the same. I can speak, at any rate, for myself. He has left me. Thank God, then, Miss Susan devoutly murmured, for he has left me. Are you sure? Oh, I think so. But how? Well, after a hesitation. How are you? Amy, for a little, matched her pulse. Ah, that's why I can't tell you. I can only answer for it that he's gone. Then allow me to prefer not to explain. The sense of relief for some reason grown strong on me during the last half hour. That's such a comfort that that's enough, isn't it? Oh, plenty. The garden side of their old house, a window or two dimly lighted, massed itself darkly in the summer house, and with a common impulse they gave it, across the little lawn, a long fond look. Yes, they could be sure. Plenty, Amy repeated. He's gone. Susan's elder eyes hovered in the same way through her elegant glass as its purified haunt. He's gone, and now, she insisted. Did you do it? Why, you dear goose, Miss Amy spoke a little strangely. I went to Paris. To Paris? To see what I could bring back, that I shouldn't. To do a stroke with, Miss Amy brought out. But it left her refrain still vague. A stroke? To get through the customs, under their nose. It was only with that, from Miss Susan, a pale light dawned. You wanted to smuggle? That was your idea? It was his, said Miss Amy. He wanted no conscience Mummy spent for him, she now more bravely laughed. It was quite the other way round. He wanted some bold deed done, of the other old wild kind. He wanted some big risk taken, and I took it. She sprang up, rebounding in her triumph. Her companion, gasping, gazed at her. Might they have hanged you too? Miss Amy looked up at the dim stars. If I had defended myself, but luckily it didn't come to that. What I brought in I brought. She rang out, more and more lucid now, as she talked, triumphantly. To appease him, I braved them. I chanced it at Dover, and they never knew. Then you hid it? About my person. With a shiver of this, Miss Susan got up, and with duskily together. It was so small, the elderly lady wonderingly murmured. It was big enough to have satisfied him, her mate replied with just a shade of sharpness. I chose it with much thought from the forbidden list. The forbidden list hung in the moment in Susan's eyes, suggesting to her, however, but a pale conjecture. A Tauchnitz? Miss Amy commended again with the August stars. It was the spirit of the deed that told. The Tauchnitz, her friend insisted. Then at last her eyes dropped, and the Mrs. Frost moved to the house. Well, he's satisfying. Yes, and Miss Susan mused a little ruefully as they went. You got at last your week in Paris. End of chapter 5. Recording by Anthony Orr. Footnote. The anticlimactic crisis of this farcical tale may need one footnote for non-elderly readers. A Tauchnitz was an unauthorized continental paperback of a British or American book, which, for purely copyright reasons, was not supposed to be brought back to England. To think of this as smuggling certainly placed, for James's contemporaries, the crimes of the ghostly third person in a hilarious perspective. End of the third person by Henry James.